Today's episode of Find Your Dream Job is brought to you by Sneaker School. It's an online certificate program from the Fashion Institute of Technology and Complex Media. Sneaker School lets you explore career paths in the footwear industry, and students get first-hand advice from some of the biggest names in the business. To learn more about Sneaker School, visit sneakerschool.com/Mac. This is Find Your Dream Job, the podcast that helps you get hired, have the career you want, and make a difference in life. I'm your host, Mac Pritchard. I'm also the founder of Mac's List. It's a job board in the Pacific Northwest that helps professionals find fulfilling careers. I believe that lifelong learning is the key to a successful career. And to get a better job, you need to learn the job hunting skills that will help you find the role of your dreams. That's why we're here today. Every week on Find Your Dream Job, I interview a different career expert. We discuss the tools and tactics you need to find the work you want. This week, I'm talking to Phiona Martin about how to apply for a job when you're overqualified. Phiona Martin is an industrial psychologist. She focuses on careers, talent, and leadership. Here's a common question from her clients. How do I apply for a job when I'm overqualified? Phiona says you must address the concerns an employer may have about your application. These include earning less money will make you unhappy, and you might become bored and unproductive. As a result, you'll keep job hunting, and you'll leave as soon as you find a more satisfying, better-paying position. Successful candidates, Phiona says, tackle these questions up front, and they pitch themselves in ways that put an employer at ease. Want to learn more? Listen in now at the Mac's List studio as I interview Phiona Martin about how to apply for a job when you're overqualified. Phiona Martin is a registered industrial psychologist. Her work focuses on careers, talent, and leadership. Phiona's key experience has been in the consulting, education, and corporate environments. As a thought leadership enthusiast, she provides expert opinions on career development on many media platforms, including her own career advice website. Phiona joins us today from Johannesburg in South Africa. Phiona, thanks for being on the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Mac. I really appreciate it.
Well, it's a pleasure. And, our topic today is one we get a lot of questions about. It's how to apply for a job when you're overqualified. And let's start with a strategic question here, Phiona. Why do you see people apply for jobs for which they're overqualified?
Mac, that's a really great question, I think, to sort of kick off the session. So there's a couple of reasons why someone would sort of apply for a role that's beneath their qualifications or experience. And some of those common reasons include, for example, relocation. So sometimes when people move cities, maybe sometimes to a smaller city or a city where the industry is not well developed, they then end up being almost forced, I guess, to sort of relook the level of positions that they will consider. And in some cases, people just want to sort of settle in as quickly as they can in their new city, maybe start earning an income. So in that case, they might compromise, in terms of, I guess, the roles that they typically would apply for. Another reason as well is, which I think we commonly see these days is retrenchment or layoffs. I mean, companies are constantly in a state of restructure. It's no longer a once-off thing. And I think most of us in our circles or in our networks know at least one or two people who've sort of been laid off due to a retrenchment or restructuring. In fact, maybe some of us have even been in companies where, that has happened a few times. So because of that being quite prevalent, that's a common reason where then, I guess, in order to then start earning another income, people would then consider roles that might not be to their standards in terms of experience and skills. Economy is also another key one. So sometimes, the economy tanks, maybe the industry that you're in is not doing particularly well. So basically, in a bad economy, people, become a little bit desperate. So they end up perhaps considering, also roles that are lesser than their qualifications. And sometimes it's just a shortage of jobs in your industry. As I alluded to earlier, some industries are not so well developed, or they go through a bad patch, so that in that case, it's hard to get a job within that field. So people end up looking within other industries, and perhaps they sort of have to downgrade in terms of the roles that they typically consider.
Another group that comes to mind is, as you list all those different examples, Phiona, are people who have been in one career and they want to switch to a new sector, and they might be 15, 20 years in the workforce, and they've got a lot of experience. But on paper, they look overqualified for a job in that new career they want to be in, don't they?
Absolutely. And I mean, that's such a perfect example. I mean, career switching has become quite common. In fact, the projection, I can't remember, I think people are expected to switch careers, 2, 3 to 4 times sometimes, particularly as we enter the fourth industrial revolution. So that's a common one. And of course, if you're entering a totally new career, you almost have to start from the bottom, because you typically would not have had, exposure, experience, or skills within that field, in spite of your age or the number of years that you've worked in.
Well, you shared examples, Phiona, of when people apply for jobs for which they're overqualified, and why they might do that. They're new in town, maybe they're following a spouse, maybe there's been a layoff. When are there instances, though, when you recommend to others that they not apply for jobs for which they're overqualified?
Look, I think for me, at the end of the day, and my approach is always, looking at the person's context. What do they need right now? What is the immediate need? So I find, many times in cases where someone is looking for a less qualified job, so if there's an element of desperation in that you need to get an income, perhaps your finances are at risk, maybe your house or your car will be repossessed. In that case, the window to sort of be a little bit more picky might not be there. But if it's a case where maybe there isn't a high level of desperation and you can take your time in choosing the opportunity, I would then say wait, so that at least you don't sort of take a step back in terms of role, and you put in more effort and more patience in terms of waiting for what's at your appropriate levels. I think it depends on the person's context.
Okay. So are there, let's talk about it from the employer's perspective, Phiona. When an employer or hiring manager, rather, gets an application from someone who's overqualified, what concerns do you see that hiring manager typically have about a candidate?
Yeah, so the concerns from the employers are actually quite valid. Typically, employers view an overqualified candidate with suspicion. That's normally sort of their default position. And some of the reasons for this is that, first of all, they almost sort of realize that you're desperate, and they consider you to be a flight risk, because their perception is that you're going to take this job just in the interim until something better comes along, and then off you're going to go. So in essence, the recruiters or employers don't want to sort of go through a hiring process, put in effort, time, and money, only for you to leave, 4 or 5 months or 6 months later, maybe when you find something in the role. So you're considered a flight risk. Another consideration that they have is that, if you're overqualified, you're potentially or highly likely going to be underutilized in the role. So they feel that you're going to get bored, So in as much as you might be desperate or you might consider a lesser role now, they feel that, the work is not going to challenge you, it's not going to stimulate you, and then after a while you might get demotivated. And then in essence, that might lead you to want to leave. Third concern is that because you come with a lot of skills, experience, and perhaps, that was commensurate with earning a particular salary. So their concern is that, because you bring skills and qualifications, you're going to come at a high price. And often, if the position is pegged lower than what your previous role was, you're not probably going to earn the same amount of income. So they then worry that, would you consider to take a lesser income? And if so, how long are you going to be happy or satisfied, earning maybe significantly less than what you were before? And another one is, if you're an experienced professional, and you're in a role where you are overqualified, it might be that your manager, your direct line manager, has less experience than you. So they might actually be concerned that you might struggle to report to someone with less experience than you. So those are some of the concerns that employers have.
Yeah, that's an excellent summary, and I want to go through each of those in a moment. But first, let me ask you this. When you work with employers and you see them hire overqualified candidates, Phiona, why do hiring managers do that? Why do they say yes to people who might bring these risks into the workplace?
Look, I guess at the end of the day, it might be you put through a compelling case. So, and I'm pretty sure we'll cover that a little bit more later. But if you put through a compelling case, and if your motivation is right, the motivations are not always sinister. There are some people who actually opt to take lesser positions than they're qualified for. And I mean, I've personally had that experience where I opted sort of for a less challenging role because at that time, I was looking for more of a work-life balance. So I think if you present a compelling case, and particularly if they buy into your reasons, as being genuine, they might then, in that case, consider you.
Okay. Well, let's talk about how to make that case. Again, you listed a number of concerns employers might have. That people are going to leave, they might get bored, they're going to be unhappy with the salary, and others that the person's reporting to might actually feel threatened by the experience and skills that a more senior person brings to a job. So when someone is a candidate for a position and they are overqualified, how do you recommend they talk about those issues both in application materials and in a job interview?
So in essence, one of the first ways that you can present your case is through the cover letter, because in essence that's where an employer will probably be first introduced to you. But in the event that maybe your cover letter is not read or is not requested, here are some of the ways that you can position yourself as a worthy hire. So the first thing I would say is address the elephant in the room. The elephant is there; it will always be there. So it's actually better if you bring it up front, because as I mentioned, employers initially look at an overqualified candidate with suspicion that why is the person here? Why are they considering this role? So it's in your interest to then address that up front. Another thing that I would also suggest is look at what's different about that role and look at what's new. So, for example, perhaps you are a sales manager and now you're applying for a sales rep, but it's in a different industry. So the way you would position it is to say, look, in as much as I reached managerial level in my previous role, this is a completely new, different industry to me. It's got a different client base, it's got different products. So in essence, it is actually sort of a learning curve for me in spite of the role that I was in. So, or sometimes it could actually be the company. So maybe you position it as your dream company. It's not uncommon for people to sort of take a step back to get a foot in the door in that particular company. So you could focus maybe on the benefits of that company and say, look, I've always wanted to work in this industry. I've always wanted to work for that company, and I'm sort of willing to come in at this particular level. Another thing you could actually do, is to sell being overqualified as a benefit to the company, because of the concerns I mentioned earlier, you can actually spin it and say, no, it's actually a benefit that I might be slightly more experienced than what the role requires. And what are some of these benefits that you could highlight? So, for example, you could mention that, you're well positioned to sort of mentor other team members, because of the wealth of knowledge that you have. You could also position it as being giving the company good bench strength. So if, let's say, a senior person or your manager were to leave, you're able to quickly step into the position, because you have the experience and you have the skills. So you almost give the company, a good bench strength, in the event that there should be some sort of vacancy. Sometimes you can also highlight the benefits of being in a lesser role. So as I mentioned, and giving this personal example, I took on a lesser role because at that time I wanted to have a little bit more time, in terms of, my kids and my other, sort of home responsibilities. So you could even position and say, look, in my previous role, being in a managerial position required a lot of travel. There was a lot of long hours, and I'm really looking, to get more time to spend with my kids or maybe to take into a hobby. And you could actually position it as being of benefit, and actually you're at a life stage where you want more time and are not really looking for that challenging type of role.
Okay.
Yes.
So we're going to take a quick break, Phiona. I just, to summarize, so acknowledge that there's likely to be a concern, have an explanation for why you want to do this, and talk about what's in it for the employer, the benefits of the experience that you bring. I also want to talk more about application materials and the interview itself. Stay with us. When we come back, Phiona Martin will continue to share her advice on how to apply for a job when you're overqualified. No matter where you live, there are always a handful of companies in town where lots of people dream of working. Here in Portland, Oregon, the home of this podcast, for many people, Nike is one of those employers. But breaking into the sneaker business is tough, whatever your hometown. You can expect lots of competition for jobs at even the smallest of the athletic shoe companies. One way you can stand out, however, is to know how careers work in the footwear industry. That's why I'm excited about Sneaker School. It's an online certificate course from the Fashion Institute of Technology and Complex Media. Sneaker School offers dozens of on-demand video lessons that feature many of the top leaders in the shoe business. In these sessions, you get to hear from designers, brand strategists, manufacturers, and other leaders about how the footwear world works and what talents and experiences these employers need. Get this insider knowledge yourself. Go to sneakerschool.com/Mac. Again, that's sneakerschool.com/Mac. Now, let's get back to the show. We're back in the Maxlist studio. I'm talking with Phiona Martin. She's an industrial psychologist, and her work focuses on careers, talent, and leadership. And Phiona joins us today from Johannesburg in South Africa. Now, Phiona, before the break, we were talking about this week's topic, how to apply for a job when you're overqualified. And I loved the strategies that you laid out for how to acknowledge that an employer is going to have concerns about someone who's overqualified, that there are reasons why you want this position, and it's important to share them in application materials, and also talk about the benefits to an employer of what you bring when you are rather overqualified. What else would you like to add? I know we were in a very good conversation before the break.
So I guess maybe just one more to add to that is I guess using your networks to sort of circumvent, the overqualified objections. As we know, particularly when you get an internal referral, it helps you to sort of circumvent, and if someone vouches for you or puts in a word for you, that might actually also be a tactic that you are able to use to sort of not to have to over defend your position as being qualified.
Okay, so look for either a reference or perhaps someone inside the company who can put in a good word and also reinforce messages you might want to deliver about why you want this job and what you have to offer.
Yeah.
Great. Well, let's talk about the application materials. When someone's putting together a resume or updating their LinkedIn profile and other online materials, some people are tempted or actually concerned that if they list all of their experiences, that's going to take them out of the running. How do you recommend people handle this? Particularly if they're 20 or 30 years into the workplace, should they list every a position and every educational credential they have?
Yeah, I think this is a really good question, and it's also quite a delicate one because it might cross certain gray areas. So I think personally for me, in terms of hiding experience, I'm always wary to advise it because sometimes the employer might interpret it as you misled them or you omitted information. It might even border on lying, so to speak. But there is, of course, a way that you can represent yourself by, trying to, I guess, minimize, what some of, your achievements and particularly your experience are without necessarily hiding. My one concern, and particularly with everything being online these days about, taking out too much of your CV is that if an employer or even a recruiter, in their search might come across perhaps your LinkedIn profile, maybe a profile that was done on you somewhere on a recruitment portal or whatever, and come across some of the information that you omitted. And, how would that be interpreted? So that, I think that's first of all where I can tell candidates to be careful. But at the same time, as with a resume, you don't have to put, entirely everything, because we tweak our resumes to suit the roles that we are applying for. It's just, I think, a matter of how we represent it. Some of the things that you can do is, I don't think it's necessarily malicious. So if, for example, the role requires you to have a diploma or a degree and you sort of have a PhD. So I guess leaving the PhD out, which is what many people sort of lean towards, or to conceal certain qualifications, may be justified because, the PhD was not necessary for that particular role. And for me, I think it's better to leave out a qualification that's not needed than, I guess, to put in one that you don't actually have. So that could be the one thing that you could do. But at the same time, the risk of that is, should a position arise, maybe a year or two in a role, where maybe your PhD, for example, is required. Now, it's a matter of, okay, how do you now bring up that, that additional experience that you concealed without potentially getting yourself into an awkward situation? So that's a consideration that job seekers might want to make if they want to conceal or remove stuff. It might actually be something you need to bring up for various reasons, within the future. Yeah. So another thing, so I think what I would recommend is a competency-based CV, or sometimes I call it a skills-based CV, which basically focuses on your skills and less focus on your chronological history. So, typically a competency-based CV or a skills-based CV, or sometimes even called a functional-based CV, it's got more or less the same elements that you would have, in your normal resume. Sorry, I'm using the word CV because here in South Africa we use CV, and I know in the US you use resume. So I'm using them interchangeably, just in case it confuses anyone. But in essence, the types of resume contain more or less the same elements, but it's just that with your skills-based resume, you're more focusing on your skills and almost de-emphasizing your chronological history. So what you could even do is to put the skills that you have obviously matched to the type of role that you're applying to. And then under your chronological history, you can almost put it, very brief bullet points, whereby you just sort of focus on the company you worked on in terms of the years. So for people who sort of maybe started working many, many years ago, I don't really think you would necessarily have to put your entire experience from like 1984, 85, because, ageism is a real thing in terms of that type of discrimination. Another thing that you might potentially do, although I'd say it kind of borders on, sort of deceit, so be careful about this one, is you can omit titles and maybe just put the department that you worked in. So, for example, if you were an HR manager within an HR department, and perhaps now you're applying for a lesser role, you could then put, the company name and put HR department and then the length of time that you were there in. Although I must be honest, probably in the interview, if they don't maybe see the title, they might become a little bit curious and say, oh, so what exactly were you doing in the HR department, for example? Another thing that you could do as well in terms of tweaking your resume is to just, I guess, de-emphasize or remove. So if you were like at a strategic level and doing a lot of managerial stuff, and now maybe you're going to be more on an operational, a tactical level, rather leave out, the strategic projects you did and, the big achievements that you had as a manager, and more focus on some of the operational things that you were doing, so that you at least align, the level of your CV to the level of the role. And then, it's not going to cause too much anxiety for the employer if they see, you've done all this grand strategic thing, yet the role is about maybe 2 levels below what you are doing.
Okay. So be honest, be consistent in the story you tell across multiple platforms. And I like your suggestion about considering a functional CV or resume, as we say here in the United States, because it does give you the opportunity to focus on your skills and not that chronology that might alert to some hiring manager, or might raise concerns among some managers that you might not be happy, or it would put the overqualification issue at the center. Now, Phiona, when somebody's in the interview room, what about money? I'd like to talk a little bit about that. How should they deal with the question about salary? You brought this up as a concern managers might have at the start when we were talking about overqualification. How do you recommend people talk about their salary needs?
Yeah, that's also a good one, because it's often, at the at the front of the mind for employers. So typically, and I know that the etiquette is that, to not bring salary unless the employer brings it up. That's sort of, the advice that a lot of job seekers get. So even if you've not come to a stage where salary is being explicitly discussed, in your motivation or in selling yourself during the interview, you could almost weave it in. So for example, you could be talking about why you're excited for the role, even though it's in spite of it being less than what you've been used to. And then you could also mention and acknowledge that you realize that a more junior role will also mean a cut in salary, and that's something that you've thought of and that you're willing to sort of compromise on. So even, I guess, before they ask, just find a way to strategically weave it in as you're motivating yourself for this role, so that at least by the time you come to salary discussions, you've almost planted the seed that you are aware that a lesser salary is likely what you may have to settle for.
And when someone has been laid off from a position, how do you recommend they talk about that layoff and address that concern you brought up about, a manager might have that you'll only be here until you find something better? How do you make the case that in fact you want to be there even after you're coming from a layoff?
Yeah, and that's a great question as well. So a layoff in many cases is not the fault of the person, of the individual. In many cases, it's structural, it's economical, it's got other factors. So I would say, in talking about a layoff, first of all, be very brief. It's normally very traumatic for people. There's a lot of anxiety and emotions that are attached. So I guess, if you are asked, about your layoff, just be very brief in explaining it and be very positive and mention some of, the highlights that you had working for that particular company. I guess, irrespective of how your layoff was handled, for example. But in essence, I think, going back to the point that I said earlier, highlight what are some of the things that are exciting you about this role. So you might even say, being laid off, has been an opportunity for me to sort of almost relook at my skills, almost recalibrate what I want in the market. And particularly maybe if it happened unexpectedly, you could almost use it as a learning opportunity to say, I guess finding myself in the job market, I guess after 4 or 5 years being in the same company, I feel like it has really refreshed me and thinking about what I want to do. And I'm sort of, feeling really energized about this industry or this type of role or gaining the skill or, being in a different market.
Good. Well, Phiona, tell us what's next for you.
I think, so next for me, I absolutely love producing career development content. So you're welcome to have a look at my blog, which is phionamartin.com. Phiona spelled with a PH and not the traditional F. And I'm going to be producing a lot of content there. You can also follow me on my social media. My website has links to most of the social media platforms that I have.
I think we first met on Twitter, and I have looked at your website. It's excellent. We'll include that link, phionamartin.com, both in the show notes and in the article on the website about the interview today. Phiona, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
It's been a pleasure. Take care. There was a lot of wisdom in that interview today. A couple of key points for me were Phiona's emphasis on getting in front of concerns that employers are going to have about your application when you're overqualified for a position. And she suggested, and I think this is excellent advice, that you talk about this in your cover letter. And if you're struggling with how to do a cover letter, we've got a guide that can help. It's called Simple Rules for a Winning Cover Letter. You can get your copy today. Go to maxlist.org/cover letter. Again, that URL is maxlist.org/cover letter. Well, thanks for listening to today's episode of Find Your Dream Job. And join us next Wednesday. Our guest expert will be Sean Lipton. He'll share networking tips for new college graduates. Until next time, thanks for letting us help you find your dream job.